probably one of the most familiar texts in all the scriptures. A gracious father has two sons. One leaves, squanders his father's inheritance, then returns and is welcomed home. The other dutifully stays, works hard, and gets frustrated with the father's kind actions towards the other. Indeed, this story is so familiar that ministers have tried all kinds of little tricks to eke out the very rich pearls of wisdom that can be found therein. I once read of just such a minister who was so enamored with this story that he gave a 16-week sermon series focused on the prodigal son. So after week 16, an elderly woman greeted the pastor at the door of the sanctuary and said, "I'm so sorry that poor boy ever ran away in the first place." So, no 16-week sermon series on the prodigal son, I promise. But it does raise the question, how to convey the outrageous nature of this story, how to relay the shocking nature of grace, which invariably stunned Jesus' listeners when they first heard it. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Long, arguably one of the greatest sermonizers of our age, wrote that the story of the prodigal son, quote, presents a picture of divine acceptance, so radical and so sweeping that it has sometimes generated astonishment and provoked sputtering outrage. But there was a man who had two sons, the story begins, and we know where this one is going. Countless repetitions have transformed what was once a parable with trapdoors and mysterious and unexpected depths into an Aesop's fable, an anecdote with a prosaic moral tag. Hey, no matter how badly you messed up in life, pick yourself up. A ready supply of forgiveness is waiting. You can start over. This is a far cry from the extremely bizarre nature of grace that this passage is meant to convey. So how to respond to our man who had two sons? How to hear this story with postmodern ears? I encourage you to listen for both grace and justice as we take another turn this morning, as we hear the story of the prodigal son from the perspective of those who were actually there. I was bored and restless. I was sick and tired of caring for my father's crops in the field. Something yearned within me. I wanted to travel, to see the world. I wanted to meet other people. I had lived on this same plantation my entire life. Do you ever get the sense that what's around you just isn't enough? I had dreams. I was talented. I knew I was. I knew I could do whatever I wanted. So one day over breakfast, I said to my dad, "I'm tired of this place. I'm tired of living this life. Can I have my inheritance, what you've been keeping for me, so that I can go out and make a name for myself?" My dad looked at me for a long moment with those clear, loving eyes of his. And I started to get a little nervous. Maybe he wouldn't let me go. Maybe I should have asked him when he'd had his wine in the evening. Maybe, but before I could think of another maybe, he stuck out his hand and said, "Okay, son, if that's what you want." "It is, Dad, thank you." He had a word with his financial people, and I was on my way that afternoon. I was so excited. This was what I had always dreamed of. I practically skipped down the dirt road that led out of our town, and not looking back either. Now, people would see me as important. I, the younger son, the one whom everyone always looked down on, the one who was always picked on, the one who was always overlooked in favor of my perfect older brother. And I had so much money, for the first time, really. I rented a camel, traveled out of country, found a place to live, and made a group of new friends. We partied a little bit. Kind of every night. There was so much feasting. It was so much fun. It was the first time I didn't have all these responsibilities every day weighing on me. Working wasn't necessary. I could get to that later. I had enough money. And I just couldn't believe how lucky I was. Sometimes I would think about home, but my life was so full that home seemed like a distant dream. So a couple of months later, I noticed that my money stash was a little smaller than I'd expected. It was true, the price for food had risen after last summer when the severe drought limited the farmers' crops. So I tried to reach out to my new friends, but they didn't answer my knocks at the door. And that's really strange. You're always supposed to answer the knocks at your door. So I began to wonder, maybe I should look for a job. I asked around, but there didn't seem to be much out there, at least nothing I was trained for. I started selling off what I could, so I could at least buy food. And then things went from bad to worse. One month I found that I couldn't pay my rent, and the landlord, eager to sell the place himself, sent me out. After some wandering, I found a landowner who would take me in order to feed his pigs for him. And I shuddered. We Israelites weren't supposed to touch pigs. The thought of it made my stomach turn. But what was I supposed to do? An empty stomach is worse than a revolted one. So I took the job. But the pay wasn't even enough for me to feed myself, because food was so pricey at that point. Even the pods I fed to the pigs looked good to me, and I was afraid of stealing one and getting caught. It was then that I started thinking, how did things get this bad? How did I end up here? I had grown up in a good home, plenty of warmth and food. My brother and I had never gotten along, that was true, but my dad, he was a kind man. I had never doubted that he loved me. I had turned my back on that, and I'm not sure what for. For money, for a chance to live somewhere else, a chance to make a name for myself. I had spent all that money. It was so much money. It was a third of what my father would make in his lifetime. How had I become that person? That ungrateful? I didn't deserve a dad like that, a man who treats his hired hands so much better than I was being treated right now. If only I could go to him, but I can't. How could I? I had practically told him he was dead to me when I asked for my inheritance, and now it was gone. God, that's so much money. I'm really ashamed. I can't go back. I'm no longer his son. A few days later, when I was so weak from hunger, I just started walking. I don't even think I had decided to go home at first, just that I was hungry. And I thought maybe if I was very, very good and explained how very sorry I was, maybe Dad would take me back as a servant. He had always been kind. He had never turned away someone in need. He would always answer the knock at a door. Still, I would have to say things just so. So I started rehearsing the speech over and over in my head. I am not worthy to be called your son. I am not worthy. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. I had plenty of time to rehearse because it took a long time to walk home. I was so tired. But finally, I found myself in my own country and then at my father's gate. I looked up towards the house. And I saw someone running towards me. I knew I looked terrible. Certainly a servant was coming to shoo my bedraggled self off of the property. The person running, it can't be Dad. I felt strong arms embrace me then, and tender kisses showered on my head and my cheeks. I knew the feel of those arms. I knew those kisses. I peered through disbelieving eyes and saw those clear, kind eyes gazing back at me, swimming with tears. "It's you!" a joyful voice exclaimed. It's really you. Thank God." Confusedly, I began my speech. "Father, I have sinned. I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." My father looked around quickly and called to the servants, "Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, put it on him, and get a ring and sandals for his feet too. For goodness sakes, get the fatted calf, kill it, for we are about to have the grandest party you've ever seen." Then turning back, he looked at me. Those eyes of love, those eyes of welcome and of gratitude, piercing me to the core, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and now he's found. I started to realize then, in that moment, that my pain and hunger and homelessness was over. And so too was my shame. I was forgiven. Weariness and relief enveloped me. I began to cry and started to sink to the ground, but Dad caught me by the arms and enfolded me into his. We both stood there and wept openly, both of us aware of God's love and grace. I was home. I sat there, mouth agape, anger rising up inside of me. I had returned from the fields, and what had sounded like an uproar was coming from the house. So as I drew closer, ready to jump into the fray, I realized that what I had mistaken for trouble sounded like a celebration. But that didn't make sense. The next festival wasn't for another month. What was there to celebrate? "Hey, what's going on?" I called to one of the servants. "You haven't heard? Your brother, he's returned home. Your father has killed the fatted calf because he got him back safe and sound, and now they're having a celebration, the likes of which we've never seen." Without a word, I retreated to the barn. I needed time to think. My brother, back again. That jerk of a son who, for some reason, my father continued to love after having been so shamefully disgraced. Oh, I remember that day very well. At breakfast, of all places, he asked for his portion of the inheritance. That type of thing just isn't done, just so you all know. He knew it. To ask for that money meant that in my brother's eyes, our father, who is always a good man, was already dead. And you know, I shouldn't have been surprised at the request. He never pulled his own weight. He was never a good worker. He never seemed to care about anyone other than himself. His head in the clouds, always full of dreams of things he wanted to do, forgetting what was needed here. He was so selfish. And then he left, just like he always did, leaving me to do it every single time. I was really sick of this, and to be honest, I was partly glad when he walked out that door. Except for what it did to Dad. I mean, the man was practically inconsolable. He spent hours every day on the balcony outside his bedroom, his eyes looking far off. What for? Did he really expect his younger son, that worthless ingrate, to return? Every so often, we'd hear word from an acquaintance who had caught sight of him. The news was never good. From what I could tell, he was off spending Dad's hard-earned money hand over fist. Stupid prodigal. He had insulted Dad, and now was just besmirching his good name by living in this way. I know the law says we should not think ill of family. I know, and I tried really hard to obey the law. But can I be honest with you for a second? I truly wished that he were dead. At least then, Dad could grieve and move on. Never, in my wildest dreams, did I expect to see him again, and never in my even wilder of wildest dreams did I expect him to return and be welcomed back into our home. From what the servants said, he had looked terrible, which kind of pleased me. Because maybe he had finally learned some lesson. But then Dad had insisted upon giving him a good robe and ring and sandals and called him his son again. What the hell? Dad was talking him back into the home. Dad was taking him back as his son. I cannot believe this. I was fuming. And when I saw Dad coming out of the party to talk to me, I let him have it. Listen, for all these years, I've been working for you like a slave, and I have never disobeyed you. All the thanks I've gotten for that, you never even let me have a small party with my friends. But this son of yours, who has thrown away all your money on prostitutes and God knows what else, comes home and you throw him the biggest party of the year? I can't believe you. Dad looked at me then with his clear, kind eyes. Those eyes that always seemed to see right through me. I looked away, embarrassed and ashamed that I had finally told him all that had been boiling up inside of me for so long about my little brother. But I just couldn't understand. What a waste of grace. Dad, was he even sorry about what he did? How do you know for certain that he has changed this time? Dad looked at me for a long moment, then he took me into his arms in an embrace. He said, "My son, you have always been with me. Everything I have is yours. That party you've been wanting, why didn't you tell me? We can do that anytime you say. But we have to celebrate and be glad because your brother was dead, and now he is alive again. He was lost, and now is found." And with a final kiss and a long-lasting look, Dad turned and went back into the house. What am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to feel about that? Is my brother worthy of forgiveness? Is Dad's love big enough for the likes of him, whether he changes or not? And what about me? Here I've been, every single day, consistent and solid. Doesn't that mean anything? Is it possible I'm missing something here? Does Dad love my brother no matter what he does? And if that's true, can that love extend to me too? Beloved of God, who are you in this story? Are you the younger brother, tearfully accepting grace and forgiveness from a loving parental figure? Or are you the older brother who has never strayed, but who has actually traveled much further away than he thinks? Both perspectives are rooted in deep shame, right? The sense of never being good enough to deserve the love of God. And this is where guilt and shame are a little bit different. For while guilt can be helpful in altering our courses of action, it's a good corrective reframing. It helps us own up to consequences of our actions. Guilt can have a purpose, but shame is never holy. Shame is that fearful little voice inside of us that tells us that we are never good enough, whether because we mess up or because we work so hard to get it right, trying to prove something to ourselves or to God or to whomever. But as we see in the prodigal son's story, shame is a liar. The truth is, we are good enough. The grace here is an acknowledgement that perfect godly love casts out all fear. We've been talking about fear a lot this Lent, and we see here that fear has no place when seeking an embrace of our loving God. That's exactly the point. All dramatics aside, this story isn't actually about the younger brother or the older brother. It's a red herring. Calling it a prodigal son story is actually a misnomer. We don't know if the repentance is genuine. We don't know if the older brother has a change of heart. And in the end, it doesn't matter. Because what we do know is that God forgives, God embraces both, God runs seeking out each one of us. God leaves the party to come and be present to us when we need that too. This is a God who showers us with grace, regardless of what we do. This is the essence of grace. It is wasted on all of us. It is squandered on those who cannot hope to earn or deserve it. That is its essence. And so we return to the predictability of this passage. Younger son forgiven, check. Older son confused and resentful, check. But what ought to be unpredictable, what should knock our socks off if we remain open to the gospel message, is that grace is not fair. God doesn't play by those rules. God's grace is extravagant and wasteful and ridiculous. It does not make sense. And that is the grace we all need. All of us. Younger and older siblings alike. All children of God. All siblings to each other. And if the utter ridiculousness and abundance of grace still doesn't wow us into gratitude and acceptance in some deep corner of our soul, then maybe we should read this story again and again for 16 weeks in a row, or perhaps for the rest of our lives. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.